Gertrude Vogel. And this is going to sound like a spoiler alert, but it's not. There's more to the novel than this. The baby that is born at the end of the novel is the story of It's My Mother. So it's the story of her birth. And I grew up learning this story. We all have family stories, and some of them just stick with you. And the story of my mother's birth was one that our family told over and over again. She was a miracle baby. She was born to a flu-stricken mother, and the entire house was down with the flu. And I don't know how many of you know about the flu pandemic of 1918. So quite a few of you do. For those of you who don't, it's second only to the Black Plague in the history of humankind for the percentage of people who died. It's started in spring of 1918 and then came back in the fall of 1918. And 1 in 5 people on the entire earth was struck with the flu. So it was pretty phenomenal. The statistics of how many died changes around, because there was a lot of places where people died that they didn't keep records of. So there's a lot of things about this novel that come straight from history. But I want to emphasize that I'm a fiction writer, not a historian. So I researched this for way longer than a normal human being would research. I actually had to put a note on my computer at one point that said, research is not writing, so that I would start writing. But in this novel, everything that happened to somebody. Once I had the information, though, I remained true to a narrative arc, which means the novel begins somewhere and ends somewhere, and I remain true to it. The pieces that are family stories, I had to stay true to. It's pretty much the dialogue that we grew up knowing, the places that it happened. Because I come from a very large family, and they would have come after me if I messed with that particular part of it. But the rest of it I took from history and gave it to characters. So there are some people who are real, there are some people who are figments of my imagination. There are several themes in it. And there's also the treatment of German Americans during World War I in America. So the xenophobia comes out in this book. And what was interesting to me was how, even though I was writing about 1918, about things that happened to people in 1918, as I was writing and researching, it was happening in the news. These things were current. All of the kinds of tragedies that the people were facing back then were things that we were facing right now. And I felt that so much that the original title of the book was This Is Now, because I'm a teacher, and so I'm like pedantic. You're going to get this message that this is happening right now. So I stuck with that title at the beginnings. But when I started to get it published, the publishers who were better at marketing than I am said, get rid of that stupid title. So I had to come up with another title. In the Q&A, I can talk a little bit more about the theory of choosing titles for your books. But I'm going to choose a reading today that focuses on the flu epidemic as it was playing out in this small town in Nebraska. The novel takes place in north central Nebraska. Most of it in Stewart, Nebraska, and the Holt County area. And the characters that you're going to meet here, the main character you meet is the doctor in Stewart, Nebraska at that time. His name is Dr. Ed Ganaway. And he was in charge of, there were two doctors in the town. And so he was on the front lines of that flu pandemic as it was playing out in Nebraska. And I think that's really all you need to know to make sense of the section that I read, that Dr. Ganaway is in Stewart, Nebraska. He has a brother who is a doctor at Fort Riley, Kansas, which is the training camp for soldiers going to Europe to, what was then World War I, which they just called it World War because they didn't know we were going to do it again. So I think that's it. Ed Ganaway and his brother Lark believed health and disease were physical conditions upon which pleasure and pain, success and failure depended. Every individual gain increased the public gain, each individual loss a public loss. Lark had once told Ed that he felt the very prosperity of a nation was based on the health of its citizens. Health was essential to the accomplishment of every purpose. Lark had claimed, while sickness thwarted the best intentions and the loftiest aims. To become a doctor was not merely to become a part of some grand institution. It was a profession in which the labors were constant, its toils unremitting, and its cares unceasing. As their favorite professor, Dr. Pierce, had once said to them, the physician is expected to meet the grim monster, break the jaws of death, and pluck the spoils out of its teeth. They were soldiers in an army whose enemy was death itself. Secretly, Ganaway thought of their work not as cures, but as conquests, and he knew his brother felt the same. The two of them had graduated side by side from medical school, and Ganaway could still remember the elation they had shared the day of their commencement, when Dr. Pierce stood at the front of the auditorium like an admiral speaking from the deck of a ship to sailors about to go to battle. Unto us are committed important health trusts, which we hold not merely on our own behalf, but for the benefit of others. If we discharge the obligations of our trusteeship, we shall enjoy present strength, usefulness, and length of days. But if we fail in our performance, then inefficiency, incapacity, and sickness will follow, the sequel of which is pain and death. Let us then prove worthy of this generous commission. Is it any wonder then that it was his brother's response to this illness, as much as the illness itself, that had disquieted Ganaway into sleeplessness? A month after Lark had written the letter in which he first mentioned the odd virus, he sent another letter. I can see a few men die. You know that. They did not mention their mother's name, but she was always with them. But to see 20 and 30 men go, row after row of them gone in hours, it's just too much. Ed had never imagined Lark capable of fear. Sanguinity the very basis of his nature. Lark had never winced in the face of anything. This latest letter could have been written by a stranger, the loops and swirls of his familiar handwriting gone chaotic in his haste. He named his fear, and Ganaway knew his younger brother was stretched to the limits of his endurance. He wanted to go to him, to help him, or die with him. But Ed was needed here, in Holt County. The sickness continued unabated by the methods taken to contain it. The memories of his patients' deaths, more ghastly than any nightmare, would be with him until his own death. With each case, he built the wall higher and thicker around his heart, and he would not let himself consider them as anything but cases. Not people any longer, cases. He kept notes in a leather-bound notebook he carried in his left breast pocket, but he did not reread them. After the first week of what became the pandemic, Ganaway put feeling aside. Only his brother's letters found a way through the wall he had built around him, and then only for as long as the paper was in his hand. He could not afford to stop and consider the depth of his horror. His only hope was to keep moving, to outmaneuver the jaws of death, even if he could not break them. The wind had kicked up after the sun went down, and the branches of the lilac bushes and cedar trees along the alley side of his house clicked and rustled like they were getting ready to move on. Ganaway stopped for a moment in the middle of his yard and looked up at the spilled swath of the Milky Way. Later in the season, he'd be able to see the northern lights from this spot. Though he'd seen the phenomena hundreds of times, it always felt magical to watch the buckle and sway of lights just above the horizon. Tonight, however, he had business to attend to, so he didn't stop long. He walked down First Street past the barber shop and the grocer's toward the back room of the bank, where he knew the village elders were holding their monthly meeting. He hadn't asked to be put on the agenda, but he knew they'd let him speak. They would not like what he had to say, but they were reasonable men, he believed. They could be convinced of the dangers they faced. Ganaway practiced the words he would use as he walked. Prudence requires that we meet our foes on our own grounds and rid ourselves of the dangers which threaten us. phrasing it as a battle would aid him, not only because of his attitude toward the practice of medicine as a kind of war, but also because men in these times had war much on their minds. If he could make them feel a necessary part of some greater plan, they would follow. We must turn all our attention and energy into practical common sense, the kind of sense I know each of you possess in great quantity, and of which this community is in dire need. He had lost 2 more patients in the last week. He wasn't sure what the death count was county-wide, but he knew he was not alone. It was happening all around the country. He wanted the board to close the schools. If they would do that, he was certain the churches would fall in line and cancel services, though some would growl resistance. "We cannot abandon God when we most need him," Ganaway could imagine them claiming. Probably William Hedrow would be the most vocal. A small man who habitually wore a big coat, Hedrow seemed to store irritating mannerisms in his pockets. He would be the one who brought God into the discussion, and Ganaway knew he'd have to struggle keeping the rest of the board on task. Since America had entered the war in Europe the previous spring, the war as subject had consumed the attention of nearly every citizen in this community. In most communities, Ganaway surmised. It had replaced weather as a conversation starter. It had, in a figurative sense, become a weather system of its own, a dark cloud high on the horizon, zigzags of lightning hitting families with draft notices, thunder rumbling of more danger to come. This new threat of a killing virus so close to home would be hard for them to understand. Either they would panic or they would try to ignore it. Ganaway's job, as he saw it, was to lead them to some middle ground. "We must take the threat seriously." He practiced the words in his head as he hung his coat on a hook by the door. "We need to take effective action against it, to be strong in the face of it." He turned and faced the men seated around the oak table. They looked to him in that dark night, so vulnerable, so innocent, gathered there in the small, windowless room at the back of the bank, and he felt the heavy yoke of responsibility on his shoulders. He simply wanted to protect the people in his care. He didn't want to wait for the state of Nebraska to lumber into action about this threat. He wanted to do what he could now. He knew this virus was passing from person to person, and though he couldn't stop it, he wanted to at least slow it down by keeping people apart. He wanted people to stay home, to hunker down as if behind bunkers. The battle against this virus felt as real to him as the battles being fought in Europe, and as deadly. "Do you think it's the Germans behind this?" Neil Porter asked when Ganaway finished speaking to the men. Because he sat directly in front of the gas lantern on the wall, Ganaway could only see him in silhouette. But he knew that his eyes would be narrow, that his opinion was already formed, no matter how carefully Ganaway answered. Having lived in this community so many years, he felt he knew the individual quirks of each of its citizens. Within his breast, he concealed the disclosures of so much suffering. "I have no evidence of that," Ganaway said carefully. "I have no reason to believe it to be. I heard a story about a woman in Boston." Porter started speaking quickly and loudly over the end of Ganaway's sentence. "She says she saw a cloud, like one of those clouds they say drifts over the trenches when them Germans release the gases." Porter had the attention of the men at the table, and he knew it. He liked it, too. He ran the barber shop on First Street, and Ganaway often thought he took up barbering because he liked to have a captive audience. Porter leaned forward in his chair as he spoke, his hands waving the air in front of him, unconsciously miming the motions of cutting hair. "She said it was dark and greasy looking, and it came over the harbor there and floated up over the docks." He placed his hands, palms down on the table before him and looked around the table at the men seated there. Next day, half the people in Boston were sick and dying. The room exploded with voices. The rest of the men put previous business aside and leaned into the new topic. "My brother-in-law sent me a copy of the paper from out of Philadelphia. Says there on page 1 that the Germans snuck ashore all along the East Coast, with vials full of germs, and they opened them up in theaters at those Liberty Bond rallies. I say it's the German products we're using. Their voices rose and fell like the caw of crows. The Germans have been getting ready for this war for years. They planted this here. They planted devastation among us. Another voice joined in. Bare aspirins are deadly. We're poisoning ourselves every time we take one of them there pills. Nods moved like a wave around the table. I believe you are all wrong, the man seated beside Ganaway opined plaintively. His voice, higher pitched than the rest, cut into the baritone to Kathleen and insisted on being heard. Ganaway winced and knew what was coming. This plague brought upon us for our own wicked ways. William Hedger wiped his nose with the back of his hand and then pulled a worn copy of the Bible out of his voluminous coat pocket. The book of Revelation spells it out clearly. First, the world will be struck by war, then famine, and then with the breaking of the fourth seal of the scroll, there will be the appearance of a horse, deathly pale, and its rider will be called Plague. He drew the word out into a gravelly 2 syllables and seemed to terrify himself with his assertion. He fell back into his seat and closed his eyes. Ganaway stared at him a moment. Gentlemen, I beg you, remain calm. If not for the reason that others count on you to be leaders, then for the reason that I am tired. He placed his palm on his chest, and I still have hours of work ahead of me before I can go home. He smiled at them woodenly. The skin on his cheeks felt fractured into lines. Your job this evening is not to find the cause of this latest threat to the safety of our community, but to act in such a way as to protect this community.